Hello, welcome to your online lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 2. Today we're going to be covering the lymphatic system. Our lymphatic system serves various functions within the body, and the two most important are listed here. It includes the maintenance of fluid balance in the internal environment and immunity. There is a third and somewhat less important function, which is the absorption of lipids or fats from digested food within your small intestine, and it will transport it into some of our larger systemic veins. But stepping away from that point, if you recall back to our lecture on blood circulation at the very end, I had taught you that when blood reaches the arterial ends of the capillaries and then diffuses into tissues, it then returns, the blood returns, that deoxygenated nutrient-poor blood returns to the venous end of the capillaries. And I'd said a small amount of that fluid is left behind, and we call fluid that sits in the tissues interstitial fluid. And about 10% of it is left behind, with 90% being picked up by our venous system. So this 10% will then be picked up by our lymphatic circulation. You might remember that green vessel that I said we would come back to. Now, if this remaining fluid was not taken up by our lymphatic circulation, then it would remain there. And even if it remains there for a short period of time, it can cause massive edema, which is swelling within the tissue. Lymphatic vessels act sort of like drains to collect that leftover fluid and prevent it from causing issues. The fluid that is collected from this area by our lymphatic system is going to be returned to the venous system. So it's the leftover fluid, that 10% is picked up by the lymphatic system and then returned into our venous system. Lymph, or what we call the lymphatic fluid, is the clear, watery appearing fluid that is found within our lymphatic vessels. Lymph sort of resembles our blood plasma, but it contains a much lower percentage of the proteins that we know are found within plasma. Lymphatic fluid is also an isotonic solution. So what have we covered on this slide? We had said that the lymphatic system has vessels and it will pick up fluid, and we call that fluid, once it's within the vessels, lymph. The lymphatic system, I mentioned, is related to the digestive system, as I had briefly mentioned, with the transport of dietary fats, and it's related to the cardiovascular system by draining excess fluid, that interstitial fluid found within cells. And the other component is immunity, and this is where our lymph nodes that contain white blood cells help fight off infection. Now, if we have a look at the lymphatic vessels within our body, they're usually represented as green, and these circular structures you can see scattered throughout are lymph nodes. Lymphatic vessels, they originate as these sort of blind-ended vessels that can only be seen microscopically, blind-ended vessels that we call lymphatic capillaries. So we can see this is a lymphatic capillary, and it just sort of blind-ended originates. So we start off with lymphatic capillaries. Now these capillaries consist of just a single layer of flattened endothelial cells. Now, as a rule, lymphatic and blood capillary networks are going to lie side by side, but they act very much independent. So oftentimes where you see those capillary networks, you'll also see the lymphatic capillaries, but they are functioning independently. Lymphatic capillaries will then form larger lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes, which I showed you earlier. And then these lymphatic vessels will then merge together to form larger lymphatic ducts, which we'll look at next. And the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct are very important ones. They're shown on the screen here. So here's the thoracic, and then the right lymphatic are important ducts that we will talk about next. So this is definitely an important slide that you should know. Lymph from the entire body, except for the upper right quadrant area here, okay, lymph from the entire body except this blue part here, is eventually going to be drained into the thoracic duct. Now, what that means is that all of this part of the body and all the lymph that's present, the fluid that's present within these green vessels, are going to drain into the thoracic duct, which starts, you can see it's shown here, but travels up here. So all of this area of the body then, on the left side and more, is going to be drained. The fluid will drain into the thoracic duct. And then from here, you can see that it's connected to our venous system. And this thoracic duct will then drain and dump its fluid into the left subclavian vein so that this fluid can now be added to our circulation. On the other hand, the right upper quadrant here, so right half of the head, upper part of the right abdomen, thoracic area, shoulder and arm, this right side is going to eventually, all of this fluid is going to drain into the right lymphatic duct, which will then drain into, and you can see the connection shown here, will drain into the right subclavian vein, also adding that fluid back into our circulatory system. So this image here is showing you where those ducts drain into the subclavian vein, whereas this slide here was showing you the thoracic duct at a bit of a lower level in the thoracic area. Remember from our lecture on the circulation of blood, we had talked about two of the pumping mechanisms that exist that help with the return of venous blood back to the heart. And we spoke about our breathing and how expiration and inhalation contribute to the movement of blood, and how contraction of our lower leg muscles in particular also help to move venous blood. This is very similar when we talk about the movement of lymph. Lymphokinesis is the movement of lymph. Kinesis is referring to movement, so movement of lymph. And it follows a similar pattern, relying on skeletal muscle contractions and breathing movements in order to move lymph in the upward direction, or in the direction towards the heart when we're working generally against gravity. Another factor that can drive lymphokinesis, or the movement of lymph, is what's called interstitial fluid pressure. That's IF, interstitial fluid pressure. And so that shows us on this graph here that as your interstitial fluid pressure increases, so does the flow of lymph. So thinking back to your tissues, when there's fluid within the tissues, the higher amount of pressure driven by products, in particular the fluid and anything dissolved in it, within that interstitial fluid, the higher that pressure is, the more it will encourage the movement of lymph entering the lymphatic system and moving through it. We've talked a little bit about how veins possess valves, and the valves are present in order to permit one-way movement of blood. Lymphatic vessels resemble veins in structure, but they do have a few exceptions. So here are a few important differences between veins and their structure and lymphatic vessels and their structure. One is that lymphatic vessels are going to have thinner walls than veins. They have more one-way valves than veins do. They have lymph nodes, and they have anchoring fibers. So let's have a look here. We can see anchoring fibers present. We can see multiple valves. Lymph nodes are not directly shown on here, but what you can see is that fluid that's in the interstitial area and how it enters in through the vein, or through the vessels rather, the lymphatic vessels. Now, as lymph flows from the thin-walled capillaries to larger vessels or into lymphatic vessels, they have a larger diameter. So as we move from capillaries to vessels within the lymphatic system, the diameter increases and the walls become thicker, and they exhibit what's called 3 coats or 3 layers, just for more support. And valves are going to be present every few millimeters, so found really all throughout the lymphatic system. Here is a diagram that puts it all together a little bit, where you can see the left side of the heart. This is the left ventricle, pumps blood through the aorta, travels through the aortic arch, down the descending aorta, which is your thoracic aorta, goes through the diaphragm like we've talked about. Now it's the descending abdominal aorta. Then we get to smaller arteries and then arterioles, and we get to the arterial end then of the capillary, where diffusion is going to occur at the level of the tissue. And then where our tissues, so all the outskirts area and in between, is going to use the oxygen and use the nutrients and then give off waste product. And this nutrient poor deoxygenated blood needs to get back into our venous system, because we can't have it sitting around in the interstitial fluid or as part of the interstitial fluid. We want it to be returned, and so it has to be picked up with appropriate pressures and places we know by the venous end of our capillaries. And then, so these would be the venules, and then we enter through larger veins, and then eventually through the inferior vena cava. And then, of course, the superior vena cava are going to be dumping blood into that right atrium, into the right ventricle, and then beginning our circulation again to the lungs and back to the heart. So remember, 90% of that fluid will be picked up by this venous end, and that remaining 10% is going to be picked up by our lymphatic system. So we can see the lymphatic capillaries here, blind-ended as we talked about. It's going to be picked up, and then we're going to be reaching larger lymphatic vessels. And we can see some valves are in place. That's really to encourage the one-way movement. We do have lymph nodes that are present at different areas, and that we'll talk more about that soon, but that will encourage the sort of cleaning of our blood. There are going to be blood cells, white blood cells present in here that are going to help fight off infection. And that's why if you ever feel like your lymph nodes are swollen when you're not feeling well, if you feel them in your neck or maybe just near your ear, kind of on the back part of your cheek, near your jaw, and they feel like they're swollen, that's oftentimes because there is some sort of pathogen or microorganism that is being fought off in there. So you're kind of feeling the activity. And then it's going to be eventually brought back up, and we know it's going to drain into 2 main ducts, which are then going to drain that fluid into the subclavian veins and then back into the right atrium. So hopefully that summary helped a little bit. So we're going to talk about lymph nodes now. Lymph nodes are sometimes called lymph glands, and they're these oval-shaped or bean-shaped structures. Some are as small as a pinhead, while others are as large as, say, a lima bean. And each is going to be enclosed by a fibrous capsule. So they really act, as I alluded to already, as this filter, a biological filter, as the lymph moves through it. And once lymph enters a node, we're going to see how it moves through by looking at this diagram here. So as you can see, lymph moves into the node by what are called these afferent vessels. So I'm going to highlight that so you can see afferent vessels. So it moves in through afferent vessels, and it will eventually leave through one or more efferent vessels. So you can see that there are quite a lot of vessels that are bringing the lymph in, and then we have less bringing it out. So to help remember this, it's the efferent lymph vessels, where E for exit, where the fluid is going to be exiting the lymph node. But once the lymph enters into the lymph node, it's going to sort of percolate slowly through all of the spaces. These spaces are known as sinuses, as shown here. So you can see how the sinuses are shaped before, and it'll percolate through here and be sort of filtered before it drains out of the efferent exit vessel. And one-way valves, again, are so important to encourage that one directional movement. You can see the valves are shown here to encourage that. To this next point, trabeculae are going to extend from the covering capsule toward the center of the node, which I can highlight here. And then cortical nodules within the sinuses, sort of along the periphery, or what we can say is the outer cortex of the node, are separated from each other by these connective tissue trabeculae that I just mentioned. So here's that cortical nodule, and that's also true of the medullary sinus, which are going to be separated by those trabeculae that extend into them. Now the center, or what we could call the medulla, is the central region of a lymph node, is composed of sinuses and those medullary cords and sinuses. Both the cortical and medullary sinuses are covered or lined in these cells that are called reticuloendothelial cells. And reticuloendothelial cells are kind of like macrophages, these large white blood cells, and they are capable of phagocytosis. And that's going to be a very important feature because of what our lymph nodes are aiming to do, which is clean up any pathogens and take care of any pathogens that are present within it. In this image, it's showing you some of the dense quantities of lymph nodes that are present. So head and neck area, and then this is the axillary region. This clinically is very important for breast cancer and spread into lymphatic tissue. So if somebody has breast cancer, one of the first places it will go if it does spread is into the lymph nodes. And then once it gets into, or I should say into the lymphatic system and then the lymph nodes, and then once it gets into the lymphatic system, then it could unfortunately end up with those cancerous cells entering into the subclavian vein and then being part of our circulation. And that's part of how breast cancer can spread. A lot of lymph nodes too are named based on their location. So just to give you two examples right now, this group here would be called the supraclavicular lymph nodes. Supra means above, and then clavicular refers to the clavicle. So these are lymph nodes that originate in and around just above the clavicle area. Another example, we have cervical lymph nodes of the cervical region of the neck, which is referring to the neck. We have another example would be occipital lymph nodes that are present in the occipital region of the head. So lymph nodes perform at least two functions. One of them is hematopoiesis. The lymphoid tissue of lymph nodes serves as a site for really the final stage of maturation for some types of lymphocytes and monocytes that have migrated from the bone marrow. So all of our blood cells are going to be produced in bone marrow, but then some might mature elsewhere in the body, and that's the case for some lymphocytes and some monocytes, which we know are white blood cells. Another function is defense that we've talked a little bit about already. The structure of those sinus channels that we looked at within the lymph nodes will slow the lymph flow through them, and this gives those reticuloendothelial cells that line those channels time to remove the microorganism and other injurious particles that might be there, remove it from the lymph nodes or from the lymph and phagocytose them. Lymph nodes physically stop particles from progressing farther in the body. And this is through a process called mechanical filtration. Because lymph nodes also make use of biological processes such as phagocytosis to destroy particles, we also get biological filtration occurring. This here is a diagram of the role that a lymph node would play in a skin infection, where you can see some bacteria are present in the tissue space, and this is showing you the infection here. We have these masses of lymphoid tissue that we call tonsils that are located in what's called a protective ring underneath the mucous membrane in the mouth. More specifically, it's called a pharyngeal, which is the throat area, lymphoid ring. And this pharyngeal lymphoid ring, or this ring of tonsils, helps prevent or protect us against bacteria that can invade tissues in the area kind of around the openings of the nasal and the oral cavities. There are 4 tonsils that we have, and we have to cut away part of some of our membranes in order to see them. So what we have is the pharyngeal tonsils, which you might have heard the term adenoids. Your adenoids are a tonsil, but they're called more appropriately the pharyngeal tonsils. We also have the palatine tonsils. These are the ones that some of you actually might not have. These are what are commonly removed when somebody says that they had to get their tonsils out. And there's also a lingual tonsil just behind the root part of the tongue. Tubal tonsils aren't shown here. You'd have to cut away even more to see them, but they would be maybe roughly in this area here. And so not that long ago, it was suspected that they didn't really offer much benefit to us, but now we know that they do contain lymphoid tissue, which means they're an immune tissue, which means they can help fight off infection. They're really part of a first line of defense when bacteria get into that area. And so when bacteria do get into that area, whether they enter it nasally or orally, and that will make even more sense once we study those areas, then the bacteria will get trapped in what are called tonsillar crypts in that area. And that puts the bacteria in close contact with cells of the immune system that are part of the lymphoid tissue. Now, if somebody was constantly getting infections, then you weigh the pros and the cons and you might have them removed. But it really wasn't that long ago that they would be removed if somebody just had a few incidences of a sore throat. Now we're going to talk about the thymus, which is a primary organ of the lymphatic system. It's a single unpaired organ that consists of 2 pyramid-shaped lobes that are divided into small lobules. In terms of its location, it's located in the mediastinal region, not too far superiorly from where your heart is. Now, each of these lobules are composed of a dense cortex, that would be the outer area, and then an inner, less dense medulla. And both the cortex and the medulla are composed of lymphocytes, which we know are white blood cells, that are sort of situated in this epithelial framework that supports our immune system. Now, medullary tissue can be identified if we looked at it microscopically by the presence of what are called thymic corpuscles. It almost has like an onion-like appearance. The thymus is kind of a pinkish gray color in childhood, and this is when it's active. But with advancing age, it becomes yellow and is replaced by fat. So in other words, the thymus is of use when we're younger, and then as we get older, it atrophies or gets smaller. So here it is, somewhat superior to the bulk of the heart. One of the body's best kept secrets has been the function of the thymus gland, which the function was only discovered in the early 1960s, but now it's understood that this small structure plays such a critical role in the body's defense against infection. So it has a vital role as an immune mechanism. The thymus performs at least two important functions. First, it serves as the final site of lymphocyte development before birth. So immature lymphocytes will migrate here and mature. And then shortly after birth, so this would be the second main function, is that the thymus begins secreting a hormone called, or a group of hormones that are collectively called thymosins. And it will also secrete other regulators that enable lymphocytes to develop into mature T cells. So here we have a pre-T cell that ends up becoming a mature T cell. Next up is the spleen. The spleen is located in the left, what's called the left hypochondrium of the abdominal cavity, so it's kind of directly below the diaphragm. The spleen is roughly this ovoid shape. Its size will vary in different individuals and in the same individuals at different times. So for example, it will hypertrophy or get bigger during infectious diseases, but then it can also atrophy or get smaller in older age. Now, like other lymphoid organs, we've talked about some today, the spleen is surrounded by a fibrous capsule and an inward extension that sort of divides the organ into different compartments. In figure B, here we can see the internal, just a basic image of the internal organization of the spleen. So we have these arteries that lead into each compartment that are surrounded by dense masses that are called nodules. And they contain developing lymphocytes, and because they have a whiter appearance, it ends up getting the name white pulp. So the white pulp is shown here, and again, that's the inner dense mass where lymphocytes are developing. Now, near the outer regions of each compartment is a tissue that's called red pulp. And red pulp is made up of a network of reticular fibers that are submerged in blood that comes from the nearby blood vessels. And so it's the red pulp network that actually supports the white blood cells in the area. So we can see the red pulp shown here, not really red in color, but it is a pinkish color that's going to be supplied by these blood vessels, as you can see. So it gives it its red color. And then here we have the white pulp where the lymphocytes are going to be developing. And then we have another structure called venous sinuses, and you can see those are the blue structure. So in between here, the pinkish was the red pulp, and then the blue structure are the venous sinuses. And so what will happen is blood will actually, when it enters into the spleen, it will pass through that reticular meshwork that I spoke about of the red pulp, where the white pulp is going to help clean out the blood and fight off any infections or any infectious microorganisms, and then the blood will end up in these venous sinuses where it will then return to the heart through veins. So that was me talking primarily about the structure of the spleen. I touched a little bit on function, but we're going to look at more detail now. The spleen plays a defense role in that the white blood cells are going to remove microorganisms and phagocytose them as blood moves through it. It's also involved in tissue repair. The spleen holds a reservoir of monocytes. So think of it as like extra monocytes that are hanging out there, that if there is an injury, then we can sort of dump monocytes from the spleen so that they can travel to an area that needs healing and repair. Hematopoiesis, so monocytes and lymphocytes some of them are going to complete their development in the spleen. So you're seeing a bit of a trend with that. Red blood cell and platelet destruction. Macrophages have this ability to phagocytose, as we know, but within the spleen, they can take up, as we've talked about before, red blood cells that are maybe not working too well, or they're older, or they're worn out. They can be phagocytosed by macrophages that are found in the spleen, and that's also true of any imperfect platelets. Phagocytose them, and then, as we've already talked about in class, we can sort of recycle some of the ingredients, you could say, from the destroyed red blood cells and use them to make more red blood cells. And the spleen is also a reservoir for blood, so we do contain a lot of excess blood within the spleen that's found within the pulp and within the sinuses. And if for some reason there is a drop in blood volume, maybe somebody has lost blood, the spleen can act as a system to put more blood into our circulation to help prevent death. And on our final slide, we'll look at just sort of a general statement of the lymphatic system and how it changes throughout life. We do see a lot of changes in some of our lymphatic organs throughout life. Our organs that have lymphocytes or lymphoid tissue do appear before birth, and then they grow until puberty, and then as time goes on into adulthood, late adulthood, they start to become smaller and will oftentimes be replaced, that lymphoid tissue, with fat or another fibrous tissue. The spleen is a structure, an organ that does develop early, and it can remain intact throughout a lot of life, but it can start to atrophy or get small in late adulthood. Overall, our lymphatic system does maintain itself well until late adulthood in most people. And then once it starts to reduce in function or becomes deficient, it does permit the potential spread of an infection or worsening of an infection, as well as even cancer. Some people have hypersensitivity of their immune system that can make them more likely to develop autoimmune conditions, where it's almost like their immune system is acting so well that it can attack itself. That's the end of today's lecture. Thank you for your time today. Bye for now.